Horror movies can be nuanced, artful examinations of trauma and redemption, cathartic vehicles by which to experience that which frightens you from the safety of a movie theater or your own home. They can also be 90-minute roller coasters of stabbing, maiming, and whatever this is. Yes, the slasher subgenre has been a staple of horror films for decades. By comparison, other subgenres and styles came and went with relative quickness, but why? While many horror subgenres are defined by their style, slashers are driven by their structure. Just as the hero's journey is a tried and true narrative structure that's persisted throughout much of fiction through time, slashers adhere to a time-honored structure of their own. The rules, unifying and remarkably consistent tropes that bind the subgenre together, both in how the films follow and break them. And while the subgenre may have started in earnest in the United States, slashers around the world have been solidifying the all-important rules since it stopped being safe to shower with your back to the door. The slasher has some deep roots in American cinema, dating back to early horror fare such as 1926's The Bat or 1943's The Leopard Man. Early examples of antagonists with hidden identities terrorizing the citizenry. Luckily, these did more laying of groundwork for the films that would follow and less cementing of animal-themed killers as the focus of those films. Don't worry, werewolves, you get a pass here. No, if we want to go back to a single movie crucial to the birth of the slasher subgenre, there's just no other choice than Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. Hitchcock had already cemented himself as the king of suspense with classics like Vertigo and Rear Window, but his 1960 masterpiece following the murderous Norman Bates was perhaps one of the most visible and critically lauded examples of a violent, mysterious killer terrorizing the heroes to date. Hitchcock remains one of the most influential filmmakers of all time, but what does that mean in practice? Well, here it means that Psycho was so damn entertaining. Filmmakers and studios have been chasing that high for the last 60 years, and Psycho's narrative has permeated the films that followed it in large and small ways ever since. Let's look at how. Psycho opens with Marion Crane, an unwed secretary, bidding farewell to her boyfriend Sam Loomis after a little afternoon delight. A single woman having sex? What a moral catastrophe. And so, rule number 1 was born. Sex equals death. Marion decides to steal a large sum of money from her boss and goes on the run with designs on using the money to settle her boyfriend Sam's debts, so they can then get married. So Marion is a thief. A before-marriage sex-having, money-stealing thief. My pearls. Rule number 2, immorality quickens mortality. Need proof? Marion stops off for the night at Bates Motel, and this happens. Sam and Marion's sister Lila travel to the motel and pretty soon surmise that something's not quite right with the owner, Norman, and his slash-happy mother. Arbogast, a private investigator on Marion's trail, reaches a similar conclusion but makes a critical error. All on his lonesome, he lets himself into the Bates house to speak with the elusive Mrs. Bates, and rule number 3, never be alone. Sam and Lila, smartly spending much of the back half of the movie together, finally uncover the mystery of the Bates family. The insane Norman killed his jealous mother long ago and has just been keeping her memory alive by inhabiting her personality and wardrobe. And when Norman gets a crush, Mother doesn't like that. Not one bit. Rule number 4, the killer is psychological trauma manifest. Psycho's narrative had an immediate and undeniable influence on the global horror scene. The UK responded towards the end of the 60s with Twisted Nerve, which featured a killer faking a developmental disorder while trying to get closer to a woman he falls for in a toy shop. As it turns out, while Martin isn't mentally challenged, he is a sociopath with some deep insecurities and some Oedipal issues not entirely dissimilar to those that plague Norman Bates. Both films even end with shots of their villains in custody. While Mother's shadow was cast long over all murder-focused movies that followed in the 60s, it was Italy whose cinema was the most deeply affected. In the years after Psycho's success, murder-centric mystery horror films began to coalesce with the literary genre Giallo, the word for yellow in Italian, and a reference to the cheap yellow covers these books would often be sold with. What we got out of that mix was the subgenre of Jallo films, which largely followed mysterious killers on the loose and the men and women who put themselves into harm's way by following the trail of blood. Italian filmmaker Mario Bava's work in the mid-60s to late 70s in Jallo like Bay of Blood upped the ante with much more gore, higher body counts, and creative kills. All of these things became regular features of Jallo as time went on, but they became the backbone of the true slashers that would follow. The Jallo of the 60s and 70s also had a massive influence on how slashers were presented visually. The killers were often obscured or shot only in close-up. Filmmakers even put viewers into the shoes of the killer with POV shots of the assailants stalking their victims. Meanwhile, in Canada, director Bob Clark implemented those POV shots into his proto-slasher Black Christmas. The 1974 film innovated in a number of ways, like letting the killer not only survive, but for their identity to remain a secret. Clark also brought along the high body count and creative kills of Italy's Jallo, packaged in the context of an urban legend about a killer antagonizing his victim from inside the house.
The calls are coming from the house.
Yes, it's a cliche now, but cliches have to start somewhere. Perhaps most crucially, during a conversation between Bob Clark and American director John Carpenter about what Black Christmas's escaped killer would do in a sequel Clark wasn't even planning on making, Carpenter got an idea for a killer feature of his own. One that would go on to become as synonymous with the slasher genre as it is with the holiday it takes place on. After nearly 2 decades of gestation, the first full-blooded slasher was born, John Carpenter's Halloween. Its style dictated as much by its low budget as its roots in Jallo by way of Black Christmas. On Halloween night in 1963, disturbed young boy Michael Myers murders his teen sister, and look at that, she's sexually active. Death sentence! Michael spends the next 15 years locked up in a hospital for the criminally insane before breaking out to return to his hometown and wreak havoc. Carpenter employs the POV shots that Psycho and Italy's Jallo popularized, but it was how it adhered to many of the tenets that Psycho laid out that let audiences connect with it in a big way.
That's not true. I think about lots of things. Now why don't we not stand here talking about them and get down to doing them?
Don't have sex, and certainly don't leave the kid you're babysitting to do it. And don't go in there alone. And wow, Michael Myers is messed up. If you're chaste and good, like Laurie Strode, you've earned your life.
The old Girl Scout comes through again.
Laurie's pristine image in comparison to her friends began another trend in slashers, the final girl trope. The idea that the lead character of a slasher, often but not always a girl, will survive because she follows the rules. Halloween did something that few films before it had. It left Michael's motives for his killing spree through Haddonfield undisclosed. Instead, Michael's doctor, Samuel Loomis, reference, characterizes Michael as less of a man and more of a force of nature.
I spent 8 years trying to reach him, and then another 7 trying to keep him locked up because I realized that what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil.
Michael's characterization as pure evil may be broader than the psychologically complex, sexually frustrated villains of the proto-slashers that came before it, but a slasher villain who was an empty vessel allowed audiences to pour their own fears in, and Halloween has captured imaginations and caused nightmares ever since. Halloween's box office success and growing appreciation from fans over the next few years put every studio on notice. Throughout the 80s, filmmakers all over the world iterated on Halloween's template ad nauseum, gambling usually low budgets for potential stellar box office results. Seemingly every holiday and rite of passage got its own flavor of slasher, with most following Halloween's flavor of narrative rules. But the most successful franchises, the ones that ended up spawning actual franchises, were the ones that knew what made Halloween connect with audiences. No, it wasn't a holiday theme, it was a larger-than-life villain. Despite starting life as a thinly veiled retread of Halloween, the Friday the 13th series understood this acutely and, after Pamela Voorhees' death in the first film in the franchise, promoted formerly drowned boy Jason Voorhees to main franchise villain. Jason was nearly unkillable, silent, and deadly, and had a penchant for mask, just like Michael Myers. More than that, Friday the 13th adhered to the same set of rules that bound Psycho and Halloween's narratives. Director Wes Craven went another way, eschewing your standard hack-and-slash baddie for something more ethereal, something nightmarish. Yes, A Nightmare on Elm Street represents what's probably still the gold standard for a slasher with a supernatural twist, featuring a slasher who attacks when defenses are lowest, in your sleep. Larger-than-life villain fueled by a psychological trauma? Check. A virtuous lead who's smart enough to keep herself awake so Freddy can't gut her? Check. It's around this time that we come to what ends up becoming a new rule of predominantly American slashers. Rule number 5, if it's a hit, franchise it to The larger-than-life villains became the main attraction, as important as the rules themselves, and made Michael Myers, Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, and the like movie icons in the mold of the Wolfman or Dracula. Norman Bates, the original slasher, was no exception, getting his own series of sequels in the 80s as well. Soon, the most visible slashers were stacking the body counts as high as they could go, while letting the quality of their franchises, vary. By the 90s, slashers were starting to stagnate. An entire subgenre which was governed by ironclad laws led to a lot of samey stories. It took completely upending the audience's expectations about the growingly stale rules to kickstart the slasher genre again. Nightmare on Elm Street's Wes Craven did just that with Scream, which asked the question, what would happen if characters in a slasher were aware of the rules of a slasher?
Jesus Christ, you don't know the rules?
Have an aneurysm, why don't you?
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. For instance, number 1, you can never have sex.
Scream's got a pretty classically slasher setup. A masked killer probes his victims with a question over the phone.
You like scary movies?
Uh-huh.
Before long, teenager Sidney Prescott gets targeted, and it just so happens to be a year after her mother's murder. Scream's twists and turns are one thing, but it's how its characters operate and interact with that knowledge that was a breath of fresh air.
Now you're no longer a virgin. That virgin. Now you gotta die. Those are the rules.
Turns out having everyone in on the rules could be pretty fun, and Scream's meta streak connected with audiences in a big way.
Where am I?
You're behind the couch.
Slasher-inspired comedies like Scary Movie and Club Dread went even further than Scream in satirizing the tropes of the genre. It even got to the point where slashers were the heroes.
Going camping?
Canada's lovely Tucker and Dale vs. Evil sees a couple of salt-of-the-earth buddies who just want to fix up their fishing cabin. Trouble is, man, everything they do makes them look like backwoods butchers.
Some kid. He just hooked himself right into the wood chipper. What? Head first right into the wood chipper.
Adam Wingard's You're Next takes a similar tack with a home invasion story that turns the final girl trope on its head by having the protagonist Erin become the slasher as the movie goes on. And she's real good at it. Jallo legend Dario Argento's Do You Like Hitchcock centered around a slasher who's an avid fan of the Psycho director's work, taking that to extremes. Still, traditional original slashers had their place. The Canadian-produced Wrong Turn took the action to the woods and went the Texas Chainsaw approach, trading one slasher for a family of inbred monsters. Norway's Cold Prey shows that the larger-than-life slasher villain still had a place on the global stage, with the Mountain Man's cool costume and savage kills harkening back to the slashers of the 80s. And Australia's Wolf Creek remains one of that country's most beloved horror movies, reinterpreting a series of real murders as a cautionary tale for anyone thinking of backpacking through the bush. Just don't go alone, which I believe is one of our rules. As Scream knew, the rules of the slasher can only go so long before the genre needs a shakeup. That's just what Drew Goddard and Joss Whedon had in mind with Cabin in the Woods. Let's be honest, Cabin in the Woods is not, strictly speaking, a slasher movie. Sure, the Buckner family may be slashers, but there are also ghosts and mermaids and middle management. Terrifying stuff. So why is it so crucial to the history and future of the slasher genre?
This is part of a ritual.
The rules. Halloween cemented the rules by which most slashers would play by from then on. It took almost 20 years before those rules were so culturally penetrative that it became unbelievable that people trying to survive these killers wouldn't at least have an idea about how to improve their odds. Scream evened the playing field by arming its knife meat with that knowledge, and in doing so, unmasked slashers for what they were at that point. Incredibly formulaic vehicles for stabby Goliaths to chase down co-eds who have the gall to explore sexuality and recreational drug use. Cabin in the Woods took Scream's meta-commentary to the next level. The setup should sound familiar. A group of co-eds take to the hills for a weekend of debauchery and quickly find themselves fending off an undead family of murderers. The reason? A global organization works to create and monitor the circumstances for trope-filled horror movies to happen to appease the world-threatening ancient ones. If everything doesn't go to plan, if the rules aren't followed in these deadly scenarios, everyone in the world of Cabin in the Woods will die. But just who are the ancient ancient ones. That's where Cabin in the Woods goes a step further than Scream. We're the ancient ones. You, watching this video, me, us in the real world, our fondness for the rules and the movies that follow them have led to the characters within the narrative being completely beholden to them, and not always by choice.
No matter what happens, we have to stay together. This isn't right. We should split up.
Cabin in the Woods' characters discover the hard way that the organization pulling the strings will enforce the rules at all costs. And when the would-be final girl learns all this, she opts to end the world rather than keep those tropes alive.
It's time to give someone else a chance.
While Scream commented on the slasher genre while largely having its characters still make their way through a movie that stuck to the formula, Cabin in the Woods interacts with that formula in a much more meaningful way. In this world, the rules aren't just background knowledge. They're both real and imposed, more like law. In fact, the rules, larger than life, driven by audience expectations of them, are easily readable as Cabin's true villain. Cabin's absolutely smashing of the fourth wall between the audience and the horror movies they enjoy has led to some truly imaginative entries in the slasher genre in the time since its release. Happy Death Day and its sequel introduced a time loop element, getting to have its cake and eat it too by killing off its final girl many, many times. And while the Happy Death Days introduced sci-fi elements, up in Canada, they opted to cross-pollinate with musicals in Stage Fright.
You tried to run, but you never could hide. Hey!
But Cabin in the Woods wasn't a death sentence for classical slashers. Mike Flanagan's Hush celebrated slashers of old by playing with perception in a new way, not just relying on POV shots of the killer, but on its lead character's deafness to create dread. Hush was even remade in India as Kamoshi. In fact, the future for classical slashers is bright, especially after the success of Michael Myers' big return to screens in 2018. David Gordon Green's Halloween streamlined the convoluted canon and refocused the franchise on why we all fell in love with it in the first place. Pure evil tearing its way through a small town. It also smartly gave Laurie Strode far more depth, having her suffer from PTSD in the wake of Michael's killing spree. Green recognized that while the rules of the slasher are an integral part of those films, the best slashers, the ones we remember, don't just feature terrifying killing machines, but characters with pathos for us to cheer for. Through time loops, broken fourth walls, broken bones, lots of those, slashers all over the world celebrate the fragility of life by demonstrating what happens when evil comes around, especially for those who don't follow the rules.
You can die with them, or you can die for them.
Gosh, they're both so enticing.
For more world tours of horror, check out our favorite vampire films from around the globe. And be sure to subscribe to CineFix for more scary movie stuff all month long.